Crickstar pressed her crystalline form against the emergency beacon, her bioluminescent patterns flickering weakly in the howling storm. The frozen wasteland of Theta 7 stretched endlessly in every direction, a white hell that had claimed her ship 3 cycles ago. Her people, the Zalathians, were beings of pure energy housed in crystal matrices, evolved on worlds of perpetual warmth and abundant energy. This frozen rock was slowly draining her life force. The beacon crackled to life, and through the static came a voice that made her mandibles click in disgust. "This is Outpost Eco 9. Receiving your distress signal. What's your species and status?" "A human." Of all the advanced civilizations in this sector, her salvation had to come from one of the galaxy's newest and most primitive species. The humans had barely mastered interstellar travel, still used crude chemical rockets for atmospheric escape, and their lifespans were laughably short. But they were here, and her energy reserves were failing. "This is Crickstar of the Zalathian Collective," she transmitted, her voice carrying the formal tones of her caste. "My vessel has been destroyed. I require immediate shelter and energy replenishment." There was a pause. Then the human voice returned, different somehow, warmer. "Copy that, Crickstar. I'm Dr. Sarah Chun, Station Commander. Can you make it to our coordinates?" "I'm uploading them now." Crickstar studied the location data. The human outpost was only 2 kilometers away, but in this storm, with her energy failing, it might as well be on another world. "Negative. Environmental conditions are beyond my survival parameters." "Then I'm coming to get you." Crickstar's form pulsed with surprise. "You would venture into this storm? For an unknown alien?" "That's what we do," came the simple reply. "Hold tight." Through her fading sensors, Crickstar detected movement in the blizzard. A massive, lumbering shape approached through the white chaos, its engine roaring against the wind. As it drew closer, she could see it was some kind of crude mechanical transport, its metal hull scarred by ice and impacts. It lurched to a stop beside her position. A section of the vehicle's side opened with a mechanical grinding sound, revealing a chamber filled with warm air that shimmered with heat distortion. A figure emerged, wrapped in layers of insulated material that made it look more like a walking bundle of fabric than a sentient being. "There you are," the voice came through external speakers. The human moved closer, and Crickstar could see eyes through a transparent face shield, dark and alert. "I'm Sarah. Let's get you somewhere warm." Crickstar hesitated. In her culture, accepting help meant accepting debt, and debt to a lesser species was shameful. But her energy core was cycling down to critical levels. Pride would not keep her alive. She allowed herself to be guided into the transport. The moment she entered the heated chamber, her crystalline form began to pulse more brightly. The warmth was life itself, flowing back into her depleted reserves. "Better?" Sarah asked, settling into the operator's seat. Her movements were efficient but gentle, removing her outer layers to reveal a compact frame and weathered features. For such a short-lived species, this human showed signs of considerable experience. "Marginally," Crickstar admitted. "Your atmospheric heating is primitive but adequate." Sarah laughed, a sound that Crickstar found oddly pleasant. High praise from someone whose people can manipulate quantum fields with their thoughts. "We make do with what we have." The transport lurched into motion, fighting against the storm's fury. Through the transparent sections of the hull, Crickstar could see nothing but swirling white chaos. The vehicle shuddered and groaned under the assault of wind and ice, its primitive mechanical system straining against forces that would barely register to a properly equipped Zalathian craft. "This storm," Crickstar said, watching the human's steady hands on the controls. "It will destroy your transport." "Maybe," Sarah replied, her attention fixed on instruments that displayed incomprehensible symbols. "But probably not. She's been through worse." "You speak of this machine as if it were alive." "In a way she is. I've been maintaining her for 12 years, replacing every component at least twice. Know every sound she makes, every vibration? She's gotten me out of trouble more times than I can count." Crickstar studied the human with new interest. Among her people, attachment to inanimate objects was considered a sign of primitive thinking. Yet this human spoke with genuine affection about what was clearly an outdated piece of machinery. The transport suddenly lurched violently to one side. Alarms began to sound, and through the speakers came the grinding noise of mechanical failure. Hydraulic failure in the left track assembly, Sarah muttered, her fingers dancing across the control interface. Not good. The vehicle began to slow, fighting against the drag of the damaged track. Sarah's expression remained calm, but Crickstar could sense the tension in her posture. Can it be repaired? Crickstar asked. In this storm? Normally, I'd say no. Sarah was already reaching for her environmental suit. But normal doesn't apply when someone's life is on the line. You cannot survive outside in these conditions. Probably not for long, Sarah agreed, sealing her helmet. But long enough. Crickstar watched in amazement as the human prepared to venture into what was essentially a frozen hell. This is illogical. You risk your life for someone you have never met, from a species that has shown you no courtesy. Sarah paused at the airlock controls, turning back to face the Zelithian. You're here, you need help, and I can provide it. What else is there to consider? The probability of success is minimal. The risk to your own survival is extreme. Probably, Sarah admitted. But if I don't try, you'll die. If I do try, we both might live. Simple math? With that, she cycled through the airlock and disappeared into the howling storm, through the vehicle's external sensors. Crickstar tracked the human's progress as she fought her way toward the damaged track assembly. The wind was so strong it knocked her down twice, but each time she struggled back to her feet and continued forward. Crickstar had studied human physiology as part of her education. They were fragile creatures, their bodies adapted for a narrow range of environmental conditions. They had no natural armor, no redundant biological systems, no ability to enter dormant states to conserve energy. By all logical measures, they should never have survived long enough to develop intelligence, much less achieve interstellar travel, yet here was one of them, working in conditions that would kill most species, driven by nothing more than an apparent inability to let another being die while she had the power to prevent it, the external feed showed. Sarah reaching the damaged track. She was moving slowly now, the cold clearly affecting her even through the environmental suit. Her hands shook as she worked, but her movements remained precise. Crickstar found herself leaning forward, watching intently as the human struggled with mechanical components that had been locked in place by ice and debris. Minutes passed. The suit's life support alarms were audible through the communication system. How much longer can you remain outside? Crickstar asked. Long enough, came the strained reply, but Crickstar could see the human was failing. Her movements were becoming erratic, and the suit's readings showed dangerous drops in core temperature. Yet still she worked, her determination evident even through the bulky environmental gear. Something shifted in Crickstar's understanding. This wasn't just stubbornness or primitive thinking. This was something her own species had lost in their evolution toward pure intellect and energy manipulation. This was the refusal to accept the unacceptable, the willingness to risk everything for a principle that couldn't be quantified or logically justified. The track assembly suddenly lurched back into position. Sarah had somehow managed to clear the obstruction and restore partial function. She stumbled back toward the transport, her suit alarms screaming warnings about life support failure. Crickstar moved to the airlock as Sarah collapsed inside, steam rising from her environmental suit as it met the warm air. The human's face was pale, her lips blue with cold, but she was alive. Told you, Sarah gasped, pulling off her helmet with shaking hands. Simple math. Your calculations were incorrect, Crickstar observed. You nearly died. Nearly doesn't count, Sarah replied, settling back into the operator's seat. Let's go home. The transport lurched back into motion, its repaired track grinding but functional. Through the storm, lights became visible in the distance, growing brighter as they approached what was clearly the human outpost. It was smaller than Crickstar had expected. just a cluster of connected modules that looked barely adequate to shelter a single being, much less support a research station. But the lights were warm and welcoming, and as they drew closer, she could sense the controlled environment within. "It's not much," Sarah said, following her gaze. "But it's home." As they reached the airlock, Crickstar found herself reassessing everything she thought she knew about humans. This one had risked her life for a stranger, worked beyond the limits of her physiology, and succeeded through sheer determination. Where logic said failure was inevitable, perhaps there was more to these primitive creatures than the collective had assumed. The airlock cycled open, revealing a cramped but efficiently organized interior. The walls were covered with displays showing environmental data, research notes, and what appeared to be personal items that served no obvious functional purpose. Welcome. Over the following days, Crickstar found herself observing the human with growing confusion and reluctant admiration. Sarah Chun operated the research station with an efficiency that seemed to transcend the limitations of her primitive equipment. Every morning, she followed the same routine, checking environmental systems, monitoring seismic activity, updating her research logs, and maintaining the endless array of mechanical devices that kept them alive on this frozen world. What puzzled Crickstar most was how the human adapted to constant equipment failures. Any Zelithian facility would have multiple redundant quantum systems, each capable of handling complete operational failure of the others. Eco-9 had no such luxuries. Instead, Sarah seemed to view mechanical breakdowns as normal occurrences, greeting each crisis with the same calm determination she had shown during the rescue. "The water recycler is acting up again," Sarah announced on their third morning together, studying a display showing declining filtration efficiency. "Looks like the bioprocessor is starting to fail." Crickstar moved closer to examine the readings. Her people's technology could purify water through molecular manipulation, but she was curious about the human approach. "What will you do? Replace the failed component?" Sarah laughed, pulling open a maintenance panel. "Replace it with what?" "The nearest supply depot is 16 light-years away." "No, we fix it with what we have." What followed was a masterpiece of improvisation that left Crickstar speechless. Sarah disassembled the bioprocessor, identifying the failing bacterial cultures that were no longer breaking down waste products efficiently. Instead of simply replacing them, she began a process that Crickstar could only describe as technological necromancy. "The cultures are dying because the pH balance is off," Sarah explained, adjusting the chemical composition of the growth medium. "But I can work around that." She introduced samples from the station's food production systems, carefully balancing different bacterial strains to create a hybrid culture that could survive in the altered environment. It shouldn't have worked. The biological systems she was combining had never been designed to function together. Yet somehow, through trial and error, intuitive leaps, and what appeared to be pure stubborn determination, Sarah created a functional water recycling system from components that any rational being would have discarded as incompatible. "How did you know that would work?" Crickstar asked, watching the restored system begin processing wastewater efficiently. "I didn't," Sarah admitted, wiping her hands on a cloth. "But I knew what each piece was supposed to do. And I figured if I could make them work together, even if it wasn't how they were originally designed, it might solve the problem." This casual admission revealed something profound about human thinking that Crickstar found deeply unsettling. Her own species approached problems through careful analysis, predictive modeling, and systematic implementation of proven solutions. The humans seemed to embrace uncertainty, treating the unknown not as an obstacle to overcome, but as an opportunity to explore. The next crisis came 2 days later, when a seismic event damaged the station's primary power coupling. Crickstar expected Sarah to begin emergency procedures to shut down non-essential systems and conserve power until repairs could be made. Instead, the human stood in front of the damaged coupling with her arms crossed, staring at the twisted metal and severed power conduits as if they had personally offended her. "The main line is completely severed," Sarah said, more to herself than to Crickstar. Can't repair it without specialized components I don't have. But the backup coupling is too small to handle the full load, and if I push it too hard, it'll burn out in a few hours. Crickstar could see no solution. The power requirements were clearly beyond the backup system's capacity. Perhaps we should begin conservation protocols? Maybe, Sarah said, but her tone suggested she had no intention of accepting that solution. Or maybe we get creative. What happened next defied every principle of engineering Crickstar had ever learned. Sarah began rerouting power through secondary systems never intended to carry electrical loads. She bypassed safety protocols, created jury-rigged connections using spare parts from unrelated equipment, and somehow convinced 3 separate backup systems to work in concert to distribute the power load. The result was a power distribution network that looked like the fevered dream of a mentally disturbed engineer. Cables snaked through corridors in seemingly random patterns. Power conduits were spliced together with materials that shouldn't have been compatible. The entire system violated every safety protocol and engineering standard Crickstar could think of, but it worked. Not only did it work, but Sarah's improvised power grid was actually more resilient than the original system. When another seismic event struck the following day, the distributed network absorbed the shock without failing, unlike the rigid original design that had been severed by the first tremor. "Your engineering methods are highly irregular," Crickstar observed. "Studying the chaotic but functional power grid." "Irregular gets the job done," Sarah replied, checking power distribution readings. "My grandfather used to say that the perfect plan that doesn't work is infinitely worse than the imperfect plan that does." "Your grandfather was an engineer?" "Farmer, but the principle applies." Crickstar found herself thinking about that conversation for hours afterward. In Zelithian society, professional knowledge was highly specialized and carefully compartmentalized. Farmers were farmers, engineers were engineers, and scientists were scientists. The idea that wisdom from one field could be applied to another was alien to her experience, yet Sarah seemed to draw knowledge from everywhere. Her repair techniques combined formal engineering training with cooking experience, mechanical intuition, and even artistic sensibilities. When the atmospheric processor began producing unusual harmonic vibrations, she didn't consult technical manuals or run diagnostic programs. Instead, she listened to the sounds the machine was making and identified the problem by comparing them to musical notes. "The harmonic frequency is off by just a few hertz," she explained, adjusting a resonance chamber that Crickstar hadn't even known existed. "It's like tuning a musical instrument. When the notes are right, everything works smoothly." The repair worked perfectly, eliminating vibrations that had been slowly loosening connections throughout the station. But the method was completely outside any standard maintenance protocol. "How did you know to approach the problem that way?" Crickstar asked. "I didn't, really. But I've been listening to this station run for 12 years. I know how it's supposed to sound. When something changes, it usually means something is wrong, even if the diagnostic systems don't detect it yet." This revealed another aspect of human thinking that fascinated and confused Crickstar. The humans seemed to form emotional connections with their technology, treating mechanical systems as if they were living beings with personalities and moods. Sarah spoke about the station's equipment the way Crickstar might describe a close friend, noting preferences and quirks that existed only in the human's perception. Yet somehow, this anthropomorphization led to better understanding of the system's behavior. Sarah could predict equipment failures days before diagnostic programs detected them, simply because she had learned to interpret subtle changes in sound, vibration, or electrical patterns that indicated developing problems. The most remarkable demonstration of this came when the station's main computer began experiencing random crashes. The diagnostic programs found no errors, but Sarah was convinced something was wrong. "She's been running a little hot lately," Sarah explained, monitoring the computer's thermal output. "Not enough to trigger the automatic cooling systems, but enough to make her cranky." The technical explanation was sound-elevated temperatures were causing microscopic expansions in circuit pathways, leading to intermittent connectivity issues too subtle for automated detection. But Sarah had identified the problem through intuition rather than analysis, simply because she had learned to recognize when the station's systems were unhappy. Her solution was equally unconventional. Instead of replacing components or upgrading cooling systems, she modified the computer's task scheduling to give the most sensitive processes priority during cooler periods of the station's operational cycle. The random crashes stopped immediately. "You treat your technology as if it were alive," Crickstar observed. "In some ways it is," Sarah replied, patting the computer console affectionately. "It responds to how it's treated, has moods and preferences, and works better when you understand its personality. The fact that it's made of metal and circuits instead of flesh and blood doesn't make it less real." This philosophy extended to how Sarah approached research as well. Her primary mission was studying the geological stability of Theta 7, analyzing seismic patterns to determine whether the planet could support future mining operations. But her methods bore no resemblance to standard scientific protocols. Instead of deploying automated sensor networks and collecting massive datasets for computer analysis, Sarah had placed her instruments based on intuitive understanding of the planet's geological personality. She monitored locations where the rock felt unstable, tracked patterns that seemed significant, and drew conclusions that couldn't be mathematically justified but consistently proved. 2 weeks into their coexistence, the storm that had raged across Theta 7's surface finally began to subside. Crickstar had spent the time observing, learning, and quietly reevaluating everything she thought she understood about intelligence and civilization. Now, as she monitored the clearing weather through the station's external sensors, she felt an unexpected reluctance to leave this tiny outpost and return to the vast sophistication of Zelithian space. Sarah was in the main laboratory, analyzing mineral samples collected from the region around her crashed ship. The human worked with focused intensity, her primitive instruments somehow extracting information that Crickstar's own quantum sensors had missed during her initial survey of the crash site. "Interesting," Sarah murmured, studying spectral analysis data on her display. "Your ship's hull material is showing signs of quantum degradation, but not from atmospheric interaction. This looks like directed energy exposure." Crickstar moved closer, her crystalline form pulsing with sudden alertness. "Explain." Sarah highlighted specific readings on the display. "These patterns suggest your vessel was hit by some kind of quantum disruptor. Not a natural phenomenon and not an accident. Someone shot you down?" The implications hit Crickstar like a physical blow. She had assumed her ship's destruction was due to the storm system, perhaps combined with pilot error during her emergency approach. The possibility of deliberate attack had never occurred to her. "That is impossible," she said, but even as the words formed, she was reviewing the events leading to her crash with new understanding. "I was surveying the system for mineral resources. There should have been no hostile forces in this region." "Should have been," Sarah agreed. "But sometimes what should be and what is are two different things. The question is, who would want to stop your survey, and are they still out there?" As if summoned by her words, the station's communication array suddenly activated, receiving a transmission on emergency frequencies. The signal was strong and clear, indicating its source was somewhere in the local system rather than from distant space. A voice filled the laboratory, speaking in heavily accented Standard Galactic. "Attention, human facility. You are harboring a fugitive of the Cordic Empire. Surrender the Zelithian immediately or face destruction." Sarah and Crickstar exchanged glances. The Cordecs were a militant species known for territorial expansion and resource acquisition through force. If they had established a presence in this system, they would view any competing mineral surveys as an act of aggression. "This is Dr. Sarah Chun, commander of Eco-9 Research Station," Sarah responded, her voice calm but firm. "I'm not aware of any Cordic territorial claims in this system. This facility operates under interspecies accords, providing humanitarian assistance to any being in distress regardless of species or political affiliation." The response came immediately, filled with contempt. "Human treaties are meaningless. This system belongs to the Cordic Empire by right of discovery. Your research station is an illegal intrusion and the Zealothian is a spy. You have 1 standard hour to comply." The transmission ended, leaving the laboratory in tense silence. Through the external sensors, Crickstar could detect the energy signatures of multiple ships moving through the outer system. The Cordax weren't making empty threats. "How many vessels?" Sarah asked. Apparently reaching the same conclusion, Crickstar extended her consciousness through the station's sensor array, analyzing the incoming ship's signatures. 3 attack cruisers and a command vessel. Against your station's defenses, the outcome is not in question. Sarah smiled grimly. That assumes we plan to fight them conventionally. Are you familiar with human military doctrine? Your species has been spacefaring for less than 2 centuries. What military doctrine could you have developed? The same one we've used for our entire history, Sarah replied, moving to the station's communication panel. If you can't win through superior firepower, change the rules of engagement. She opened a channel to the approaching ships. Cordic vessels, this is Eco 9. Before you do something you'll regret, you should know this station is currently experiencing containment failure of our experimental quantum reactor. Any hostile action could trigger a cascade reaction that would sterilize this entire system. It was a complete fabrication. The station's power systems were conventional fusion reactors, and there was no experimental quantum technology anywhere in the facility. But Sarah delivered the lie with such casual confidence that even Crickstar found herself believing it for a moment. "You are attempting to deceive us," came the Cordac response. But there was uncertainty in the voice now. "Feel free to test that theory," Sarah replied. "But if I'm telling the truth, your empire will lose 4 ships and gain nothing but a dead system. If I'm lying, you'll have no trouble destroying 1 small research station." "Your choice." While the Cordax considered this, Sarah was already moving through the station, activating systems and modifying settings with the same intuitive efficiency she brought to all her tasks. Crickstar followed, trying to understand what the human was actually doing. "You cannot bluff indefinitely," Crickstar pointed out. "Their sensors will detect that you have no quantum reactor." "True," Sarah admitted, adjusting the fusion reactor's magnetic containment fields. "But I don't need to bluff indefinitely. I just need to buy enough time to make the bluff real." What followed was another display of the impossible improvisational genius that Crickstar had come to recognize as uniquely human. Sarah began modifying the station's systems, not to create an actual quantum reactor, but to produce sensor readings that would be indistinguishable from one. She rerouted power through the station's communication array, creating electromagnetic pulses that mimicked quantum field fluctuations. She vented superheated plasma from the fusion reactor in patterns that would register as quantum cascade precursors. She even used the station's mineral processing equipment to create trace radioactive particles that would suggest exotic matter interactions. None of it was real, but to external sensors. The station would appear to be containing barely stable quantum processes that could indeed sterilize the system if they went critical. "Ingenious," Crickstar admitted, watching the carefully orchestrated deception take shape. "But this will only delay them. Eventually, they will realize the deception and attack regardless." "Maybe," Sarah said, fine-tuning the electromagnetic pulse generators. "But while they're trying to figure out if I'm lying, I'm also transmitting everything that's happening to the interspecies council through the quantum communication relay." Crickstar hadn't even noticed the secondary transmission. Sarah had embedded the distress signal within the fake quantum reactor emissions, disguising it as random energy fluctuations while broadcasting detailed records of the Cordic territorial violation and threats against a legitimate research station. The Council response. "Fleet is 12 hours away," Sarah continued, monitoring the transmission confirmation. "So we just need to keep the Cordax guessing for a few more hours." But the Cordax were apparently reaching their own conclusions. The lead ship began moving toward the station, its weapon systems charging for attack. "They're calling your bluff," Crickstar observed. "Then we move to Plan B, which is..." Sarah's smile was fierce and determined. We stop bluffing and start fighting. The station's defenses were minimal by galactic standards, just a few point defense lasers designed to destroy incoming meteors. Against Cortec attack cruisers, they would be worse than useless. But Sarah wasn't planning to fight the ships directly. Instead, she began implementing a strategy that could only have emerged from a species that had spent millennia fighting superior enemies and winning through cunning rather than strength. If she couldn't destroy the Cortec ships, she would make them destroy themselves. The first cruiser moved into attack position, its weapons targeting the station's main modules. At the precise moment its firing solution locked on, Sarah triggered the mineral processing facility's emergency venting system, releasing a cloud of metallic particles into space around the station. The Cortec weapons fire hit the particle cloud and scattered, creating a dazzling display of reflected energy that temporarily blinded their targeting systems. But that was just the distraction. The real trap was what Sarah had suspended within the particle cloud. "Are those mining charges?" Crickstar asked, detecting the small explosive devices hidden within the metallic debris. "Improvised orbital mines," Sarah corrected. "The particle cloud hides their signatures until they're armed." The first cruiser, realizing its targeting systems were compromised, moved closer to the station to improve its firing solution. As it passed through the particle cloud, proximity sensors triggered the mining charges, creating a series of explosions that damaged its hull and disabled its forward weapons array. The second cruiser, learning from its companion's mistake, attempted to clear the particle cloud with its own weapons fire. But Sarah had anticipated this response, using the station's magnetic field generators to guide the explosive debris in specific directions. The cruiser's weapons fire triggered a chain reaction that sent shrapnel racing through its own flight path, forcing it to take evasive action that carried it directly into another cluster of hidden mines. "Impossible," Crickstar breathed, watching the carefully orchestrated ballet of